Elena was a teacher who loved surprising her students. On a gray Monday morning, she walked into the classroom, placed a large map of the United States at the table, and said, "Today I'm going to prove to you that the world looks very different from what you think." "Which state is both the easternmost and westernmost in the U.S.?" she asked. Students called out from every direction, "Maine, Florida, California." Elena shook her head and smiled. "Alaska." Disbelieving murmurs filled the room. She explained that the Aleutian Islands, a long chain of volcanic islands stretching from Alaska far into the Pacific, crossed the 181st meridian, the imaginary line separating the Western from the Eastern Hemisphere. Some of these islands lie technically within the Eastern Hemisphere, making Alaska both the easternmost and westernmost state in the U.S. Maine, which most people would instinctively name, has to concede that title. "And which state is closest to Africa?" Elena continued. This time the answer was even more unanimous. Florida, obviously, but again she shook her head. "Maine." The distance from Maine's easternmost point to the coast of Morocco is roughly 3,150 miles. From Miami, it's nearly 4,250 miles. The reason lies in the curvature of the Earth and the actual extent of Africa. The continent reaches much farther north than most people realize. On a flat map, Florida looks closer. The round Earth tells a different story. Then Elena talked about people in space. If you were to draw a line just west of San Antonio, Texas, 80% of all Americans would live east of it, and only 20% in the west. The East has been densely populated since colonial times. New York, Chicago, Washington. The West, on the other hand, is defined by deserts, mountain ranges, and endless open spaces that continue to make widespread settlement difficult to this day. National parks, forests, and protected areas cover enormous stretches of land. The most extreme example of this emptiness is Wyoming. With just under 580,000 residents, it is the least densely populated state in the country, and there are more cattle than people there, roughly twice as many. Ranching dominates the economy, and beef is one of the state's most important exports. Wyoming is the living symbol of how much the American West is still shaped by nature and agriculture. A student in the second row raised his hand. "What about Canada? Isn't that the longest border in the world?" Elena nodded approvingly. At roughly 5,525 miles, the border between the U.S. and Canada is indeed the longest international border on Earth. It runs from the Atlantic to the Pacific, crossing the Great Lakes, prairies, forests, and mountain ranges. The border between Alaska and Canada alone measures over 1,500 miles. Unlike many borders around the world, it is unfortified and stands as a symbol of peace and good neighborly cooperation. Not far from this border lie the Great Lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Together, they hold about 21% of all surface fresh water on Earth. Over 40 million people in the U.S. and Canada get their drinking water from this system. The lakes were formed at the end of the last age when glaciers retreated and left deep basins behind. Today, they are protected by the Great Lakes Compact, a legally binding agreement between 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. Elena now pointed to Colorado on the map, a seemingly perfect rectangle. "But is it really a rectangle?" she asked mysteriously. When Colorado was admitted as a state in 1876, its borders were meant to follow specific lines of latitude and longitude exactly. However, the surveying instruments of the 19th century were nowhere near as precise as modern GPS technology. Upon closer inspection, Colorado actually has 697 corners instead of 4, small corrections and inaccuracies that accumulated over the decades. The same is true for other states with supposedly straight borders. For the next fact, the students really had to rethink things. Where is the largest rainforest in the US? Hawaii, many called out. Or Florida? Elena shook her head again. Alaska. The Tongass National Forest in southeastern Alaska covers over 16.7 million acres, making it not only the largest national forest in the US, but also a temperate rainforest, part of the largest remaining temperate rainforest in the world. Sitka spruce, hemlock, and red cedar forests are home to bears, wolves, and salmon. For indigenous peoples, this land has been home for thousands of years. Today, the Tongass is threatened by logging and climate change. In California, 2 geographic extremes lie only about 85 miles apart. Mount Whitney at 14,505 feet, the highest peak in the contiguous 48 states, and Badwater Basin in Death Valley, the lowest point on the continent at 282 feet below sea level. This dramatic proximity of height and depth is the result of tectonic forces. Death Valley formed through the stretching and thinning of the Earth's crust, while Mount Whitney was thrust upward by tectonic collisions. Then Elena got to the Mississippi. The drainage basin of this mighty river carries water from 40% of the entire U.S. landmass, spanning 31 states and covering roughly 1.2 million square miles. The Mississippi itself is about 2,340 miles long, the second longest river in the country after the Missouri. The river system feeds American agriculture, connects cities, and carries millions of tons of cargo to the Gulf of Mexico. But there is a darker side. Agricultural runoff flows into the Gulf, triggering massive algal blooms that suffocate marine life. And then, a fact that made even the bored students in the back row perk up. In 1811 and 1812, massive earthquakes shook the area around New Madrid in present-day Missouri. The quakes were so powerful that the Mississippi River temporarily flowed backward. Eyewitnesses reported waterfalls suddenly forming in the river and water surging upstream. The ground sank in places and new lakes appeared. To this day, the New Madrid seismic zone is considered one of the most dangerous earthquake regions in North America. From rivers to seas, the coastline of the Pacific Northwest, particularly the mouth of the Columbia River, carries a grim nickname, the Graveyard of the Pacific. More than 2,000 ships have sunk there, defeated by dangerous currents, shifting sandbars, dense fog, and sudden weather changes. Lighthouses, jetties, and specially trained bar pilots work to prevent the worst disasters, but the sea always has the final say. Underground, another wonder awaits. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the longest known cave system in the world, with over 400 miles of explored passages and potentially far more yet to be mapped. Limestone hollowed out by groundwater over millions of years has created an underground labyrinth that houses unique ecosystems, including blindfish and rare bat species. The U.S. has both hot and cold deserts. The Great Basin in Nevada and Utah experiences freezing winters with snowfall. and yet it ranks among the driest areas in North America. As climate change advances, the desert's boundaries are slowly expanding, with far-reaching consequences for ecosystems, water supply, and agriculture. And finally, Hawaii is literally growing. Kilauea on the Big Island is one of the most active volcanoes on Earth. When lava flows into the ocean, it solidifies and adds new land to the coastline. Over the past few decades, the island has gained hundreds of acres this way. The same volcanic forces that can destroy homes also create fertile soils and the lush landscapes that make Hawaii so unique. Elena rolled up the map. "The world," she said, "always looks neater on paper than it really is." The students were silent and thinking. That was exactly what she wanted.